Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight's show is called Activism versus Narcissism and, of course, propaganda. We're going to be going over some familiar territory and some new things too. I've had a lot of information sent to me by one of our very much valued correspondents, and we're going to go through some of that alongside all of the other stuff which I had planned. So in France there have been mainly focused protests on the imposition of taxation and unpopular and unnecessary policies from the globalist puppet Macron. Yes, he's been found out. In the UK there have been fringe protests using the yellow vest, and the state is in full propaganda mode as per usual. Brexit is far right, Trump is evil, and climate change is the new apocalypse. Nothing new there then. I'm going to do a quote here, a little quote to get us started. In his 1840 book, Democracy in America, the renowned French diplomat and historian Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, quote, "If despotism were to establish itself in today's democratic nations, it would probably have a different character. It would be more extensive and more mild, and it would degrade men without tormenting them." That's what they call ideological subversion, isn't it? I think we're used to that. It carries on. "The sovereign, after taking individuals one by one in his powerful hands and kneading them to his liking, reaches out to embrace society as a whole. Over it he spreads a fine mesh of uniform, minute and complex rules through which not even the most original minds and most vigorous souls can poke their heads above the crowd. He does not break men's wills, but softens, bends and guides them. He seldom forces anyone to act consistently, but consistently opposes action." He seldom forces anyone to act, but consistently opposes action. Very important, that. "He does not destroy things, but prevents them from coming into being." That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Deplatforming in the 1800s. It carries on. "Rather than tyrannise, he inhibits, represses, saps, stifles and stultifies, and in the end he reduces each nation to nothing but a flock of timid and industrial animals, with the government as its shepherd." De Tocqueville penned these nearly 2 centuries ago, but they could easily and frighteningly be applied to Europe today, from an article written on the repressive and undemocratic Lisbon Treaty, which we might get to later, as we might be joined by Piers Corbyn later in the show. We've got Sandi Adams here, and we're broadcasting from Windows Towers in Glastonbury. And Sandi's been making some notes here, and he's going to come in very soon. But in line with tonight's dissection of the fake news and narcissism versus activism theme, a recent post on a social media platform quoted a hit piece on Jeremy Corbyn from The Guardian that over 80%, I think it was 88% of the Labour Party members voted to remain, and Corbyn, by following the will of the voting public and the constitutional law, was somehow betraying this tool of globalist subversion. Incidentally, this fella had just been awarded an MBE, the one who posted it, and made these rather strange statements which go against democracy as we know it. But of course, a left-wing radical who hates the monarchy, who's just been given an MBE, is the person I'm going to be referring to. Now, fake left narcissistic view of the world is brilliantly summed up in the opening quote that we've just had there. So apart from the Stasi of unelected officials and superstate to destroy all identity of its member states and the Coudenhove-Kalergian Pan-European Plan, which outlined the fate through the unification of the EU world order, the Europeans are bemoaning their plan from here. As Wynne Godley argued so eloquently when the Maastricht Treaty was signed in 1992, the strictures that it and the euro would impose on Europe would lead to its impoverishment, not its prosperity. Now, this is all part of the Global Action Plan. This is to get everybody down to the level of poverty. Of course, this is also Agenda 2030, which we talk about quite a lot, and of course is brought up in our talks, The Bigger Picture. Do book one through the website if you would like to bring some information to your local area. But let's carry on with tonight's theme. The role of subversion is to dismantle our reality and anything which was regarded as true, and promote everything which opposes natural law and is not true. The empty gestures of the over-entitled know no bounds. We're going to be getting into that tonight. And to kick us all off with this, to give us a bit of perspective, a recent posting on a forthcoming narcissist activist day out site stated, "Let's carry a coffin down the high street for all the species that have died, and let's go into mourning for the end of the world." No, this is not the insane message of a demented cult leader, but a day out for those who have joined the globalist-backed Extinction Rebellion cult, led by corporate-backed activists and a congregation who do not read even the report which is the founding manifesto of their cult. The made-up catastrophobic fictional story, aka the UN IPCC Special Report 15, this is what we're talking about here. And as we reported in previous shows and on our fake activism specials, including Extinction Rebellion equals fake protest, which you can find at Windows on the World, which incidentally has all of the information you need to know about this organisation and its globalist links. Well, when we actually talked to people who were meant to be representing this organisation, they didn't even know what the SR15 IPCC report was. That's what I'm referring to there. So the actual founding document of this extinction cult is not even known or read by its own members. Now, I think even the Moonies would be a bit more kind of up to speed with the quotations from their great leader than this lot. So this is where the social engineers have done something very clever. After promoting the cult of narcissism and self-obsession through the New Age onwards and into the pampered, self-obsessed lifestyle cult of me, myself and I, and back to me again. So now we have the obsession with political correctness and the assuming of honorary victim status at all times in every form of the new identity politics. An even newer form of globalist puppet has been created. The narcissist activist in modern parlance is a virtue signalling mentally helpless puppet without a mind which attaches itself to all fashionable causes within the accepted politically correct opinion corridor. A guardian quoting, latte swilling, mentally helpless repeater of cliches. I've written some of this down actually. I'm actually quoting from my own little script here tonight. And we're going to get off script in a minute. From the well-established and, of course, mentally helpless but opinionated scribblers of The Guardian, we now have a new disease which is being spread throughout the activist community, the narcissist activist community. It's called Monbiot-itis, named, of course, by its founder, George Monbiot, who's been promoting scare stories and untruths for many years in that newspaper which is always begging for donations, called The Guardian. The projection of pre-traumatic stress disorder for something which is not only unlikely but could be guaranteed not to happen after looking fleetingly at those elusive but only seconds away facts. That's a very good point, isn't it? Because all of the stuff which is talked about every day in papers such as The Guardian, I won't leave The Independent out and all the others, is that there's an assumption that people don't do any research. Because if you actually look up any of this stuff, catastrophic global warming and the sea level rises and all the stuff they've made up about Brexit, none of it is actually true. So the predictions of the press from Brexit to rising sea levels are proof that opinion and repetition has taken over from all previous efforts at critical thinking, or even doing 5 minutes of research before typing some drivel badly, and often with no attention to grammar, let alone logic, but plenty of misplaced rhetoric. The fake news stories about Brexit and climate change alone fill acres of space every day with fact-free but scary fairy stories. There are no journalists in the UK, and the ones who are championed are either lying propagandists, fence sitters or gatekeepers. I'm coming to this conclusion now. I have been searching for journalists since Windows on the World started, and we do know a few, but none of them are in the mainstream media. So no, this is not exaggeration. Please find me one. Put it in the chat box. Along with this is the socially engineered world of identity politics and trivia to keep the distraction going. And then there is the controlling of all narratives by banks. We're going to get into that as our first article. I was going to actually bring Sandi in. She's just actually about to come back into Windows Towers. Yep. And yes, she's now
I'm here.
Back in the room again. Yes.
I'm here.
Yeah, that was interesting, wasn't it? So yeah. I hope this wasn't boring you,
No, not at all. I just closed the door because the draft
was
coming through.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, this is very interesting, isn't it? The way this is all developing, and of course you've got this sort of what did start as a grassroots protest in France. I don't care what anybody says, because most of those people were in their 50s and 60s who were coming out of the countryside to start with. People have claimed ownership of the yellow vesting, as can be expected, and there are people spouting various what can only be called conspiracy theories about the origins of it, because it's actually grown as a real grassroots thing. It will be taken over and the people will be demonised. That's already happened. But once you do get a kind of mass of people who've got one good aim, or even several aims, but let's focus on the one that they wanted to start with, which is the fuel prices, which they were outraged over. I mean, if you want to listen to the other things that Macron brought in, like the compulsory vaccinations and all these other things that he's just rolled out, being the puppet that he is, then check out what he's actually done. There's a fella called Roman Light. I don't advocate anyone following any leaders, but he's sort of speaking on behalf of people who are the yellow vests. I'm very cynical about people who put themselves as leaders, but the guy is actually talking some common sense. So what do you make of it all, Sandi?
Yeah, well, I mean, I looked at Roman Light, and it does seem that it did start as a proper grassroots kind of organisation that is genuinely upset about this, the taxes, the carbon taxes, everything else, and the corruption in local councils and everything that we're seeing now. And you know, it's interesting because there is a grassroots thing springing up in Bridgewater at the moment with and they are older people that seem to know what's going on, and they're against council corruption, and they're marching every Sunday to the council offices in Bridgewater. And I think, you know, it's only a small group, but it could grow. But as you say, it will be infiltrated and taken over by by possibly Extinction Rebellion or people that want to demonise it, or they'll demonise it and try and stamp it out. It'll either get taken over or demonised, and you know. But I think there's enough people, I think, to gain ground on this, because so long as we're clear about the issues that are at stake here, and it doesn't get clouded or taken over by any climate change nonsense or any demonisation or any slurs of it being right-wing. It is not right-wing. It is simply trying to address the problems that we're facing.
That's the narrative that we've been reporting on for months, ever since it came out of MI5, that the rise of the far right was going to be the new terror threat. And of course there's all these papers that we've reported on, the fringe insurgency. All of these things have one thing in common, though: there's no proof to anything they actually say.
Yeah.
So they're all fake news, really. And of course, yeah, the far right. I mean, laughably, myself and Piers Corbyn got deemed far right and neo-Nazi by some hysterical lunatic on Twitter who's now had to pipe down. But the thing is about this, it's the propaganda and it's what sticks. And we're going to be talking about that a bit tonight as well, a bit later in the show. But this first thing I wanted to get into, the terrifying rise of financial blacklisting. This actually came from Breitbart, which is not a website that I would recommend. It has its own agenda. I don't recommend any website, actually, apart from Windows on the World. It's the only one that I put control of. So, Visa and MasterCard deny service to customers for political reasons. The Liberal Electronic Frontier Foundation, which I've looked up, which is quite interesting, actually, if you go on there. It's all meant to be about freedom of the internet. It warned that banks and credit card companies had become de facto internet censors, which indeed they have. Payment processing depends on our ability to use the global payment network, and they have rules for what they will process. This extra layer places platforms like Patreon in an impossible position: abandon free speech or lose your ability to protest payments. This is, of course, a big problem with PayPal, who've actually already banned quite a few people. I mean, this is basically a business. How can you, as a business, as a transaction business, it's basically all of these banking businesses are really parasitical in the respect that what they do is they make money out of financial transactions between two parties, which is something that's costing them very little. For instance, on PayPal, you pay quite a lot. You know, I mean, I get some donations on PayPal, and it's quite surprising how much they take out for doing nothing really. Yeah. You know, just for hosting a website, an interface.
But even worse if they're shutting down free speech.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's also why so many free speech alternatives to Patreon have failed. Freestar, Hatreon, Maker Support and Subscribe Star all tried to offer a more open platform and were promptly dumped by the credit card companies. All were unable to do business. So I wanted to tell you about this organisation, which is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Have a look at it, it's quite interesting. It said it's deeply concerned that payment processors are making choices about which websites can and can't accept payments or process donations. An EFF spokeswoman told Breitbart News this can have a huge impact on what types of speech are allowed to flourish online. Well, of course it does. The EFF spokeswoman says it should not be the responsibility of financial institutions to judge what speech is and is not acceptable on the web. Well, all that's pretty obvious, isn't it? But why have we let this even become an issue? This is beyond what we call Orwellian. And of course, this is the whole global action plan to destroy nations, to destroy culture, and to have everybody at poverty level. This is the aim, and has been the aim for the past 100 years. This is the aim now of the principles of Agenda 2030, the UN Agenda 2030, which we talk about all the time, which people are useful idiots who have not been elected, such as the cabinet member for the environment in Walthamstow, call a hugely discredited conspiracy theory, which they are actually implementing every day of their miserable lives. So, as a useful tool for all, we're going to get onto this now, in the propaganda war. Recommended reading, now get this, is the Hasbara Handbook, which is basically defending Israel for students on campus. And this is a great example of what can be termed propaganda and how propaganda is analysed. It's actually very interesting. This Hasbara, it says here, and this is a definition of the word, is one of those wacky Israeli words that defy translation. Well, it doesn't really. I say Israeli, it says here, because the Hebrew term can be translated. Oh, so that's a bit contradictory, isn't it? Hasbara is simply the act or profession of explaining. It carries on, but in the world of Israeli politics and diplomacy, Hasbara has acquired a much more complex meaning. Oh, what a surprise. Some would say that Hasbara is a laundered word, the term used by David Grossman in his book The Yellow Wind to describe innocuous words used by Israelis to cover up inconvenient truths, and that Hasbara's true meaning is propaganda. But the equation totally misses the essence. While propaganda is invariably a mixture of half-truths, fabrication and downright lies, Hasbara generally employs a highly selective version of true facts. Well, selecting your facts for the purposes of argument is propaganda, right? This is great. I love taking apart this kind of rhetoric. It's quite good fun. So in the interest of balance and propaganda, let's look at the Hasbara Handbook, page 22. Propaganda is used by those who want to communicate in ways that engage the emotions. I'll read that out again, everybody, just in case it flew by. Propaganda is used by those who want to communicate in ways that engage the emotions and downplay rationality in an attempt to promote a certain message. To effectively present Israel to the public and to counter anti-Israel messages, it is necessary to understand propaganda devices. Bearing in mind this is going out to students. Okay, that seems to go against the definition they have given to Hasbara, just that article there, which is in their handbook. This article applies, it says here, a list of 7 propaganda devices to the Israeli situation, and by doing so allows an understanding of some of the ways in which public opinion is fought for in the international arena. Here is just one of those 7, and it's labelled name calling. Through the careful choice of words, the name calling technique links a person or an idea to a negative symbol. Wait a minute.
Hang on
Don't
a
we
minute.
hear this every day
Yes.
in the mainstream news? Have they been reading the Hasbro handbook?
Racist. You're a racist. You're a right winger.
I suppose you think that Elvis's brain is on the moon. I suppose you think that that people who vote Brexit aren't far-right racists.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the sort of thing. I suppose you think that reptiles run the earth with your Agenda 21 conspiracy theories of a global governance. There you go. Yes, it gets. Yeah. Why is it used in every newspaper in this country then? If this is out of the Hasbara handbook, that's something to think. Well, because it's not really native to Hasbara handbook. This is the nature of propaganda, which goes back to the old Soviet system and before that. So, in other words, it's not really to do with Hasbara, it's to do with propaganda.
And subversion.
And subversion.
Yeah.
So, basically, this is just a new kind of reading of it. Yes. So creating negative connotations by name-calling is done to try and get the audience to reject a person or idea on the basis of negative accusations without allowing a real examination of that person or idea. The most obvious example is name-calling. Okay, the most obvious example is name-calling. They are a neo-Nazi group. Now, they actually use that in the Hasbro handbook. Now, how many of these people are calling people who think for themselves neo-Nazis?
Yeah.
So they have just, it's straight out of a handbook.
Absolutely.
Is this handbook given to every fake news outlet in the country and around the world?
Either that or something similar, because and also in every university in England, because if you look at what that actually says, it the fact that you engage their emotions more than the reality. You've got a whole bunch of students in this country who are offended by everything.
Yeah.
We use the term snowflakes because they simply don't engage with reality. It's all about their feelings. It's all about feelings, isn't it?
That's what we're talking about, really. That's why we called this show Narcissists versus Activists, or Activists versus Narcissists, because it completely sums up this whole method and ideology that's being used to demonise everything outside the narrow corridor of accepted opinion, as we have come to term it. Yes, it's quite bad. So the most obvious example is name calling. They are a neo-Nazi group. Tends to sound pretty negative to most people. More subtly, name-calling works by selecting words with subtle negative meanings for some listeners. For example, describing demonstrators as youths creates a different impression from calling them children. For the Israel activist, it is important to be aware of the subtly different meanings that well-chosen words give. Call demonstrations riots. Many Palestinian political organisations call them terror organisations and so on. Now, you hear this all day long, don't you? For the Israel activist, it is important to be aware of the subtly different meanings that well-chosen words give. Yes, remember that one. Call Brexit far right, call political debate hate, call criticism of propagandists in the Labour Party anti-Semitic, straight out of the advice section in the Hasbara handbook. Now, I've never actually read this handbook before, and I didn't have time to go through the whole thing, but it's very revealing, and it perfectly sums up the state of British media. Check out the lobby on Al Jazeera and the Channel 4.com, the Israeli lobby, and we're going to move on now very swiftly to more propaganda. Now, Hope Not Hate and fellow agents of the Ministry of Propaganda, Tel Mama, create state-manufactured hate for third-party interests. Now, here we go. This was from Andrew Gilligan in 2013. Now, this Tel Mama is still on Facebook scrounging money, even though they've actually been, let's call them deplatformed by the government, really, because they were basically, let's not beat about the bush, making up things and calling them hate speak when they weren't. So they were telling porkies about that, basically. A controversial project claiming to measure anti-Muslim attacks will not have its government grant renewed after police and civil servants raised concern about its methods. Now, bear in mind, this is 2013 and they're still going. The project, called Tel Mama, claimed that there had been a sustained wave of attacks and intimidation against British Muslims after the killing of drummer Lee Rigby, with 193 Islamophobic incidents reported to it, rising to 202 last weekend. Well, this was in 2013. The group's founder, Fayaz Mughal, said he saw no end to this cycle of violence. describing it as unprecedented. The claims were unquestionably repeated in the media. Tell Mama and Mr Mughal did not mention, however, that 57% of the 212 reports referred to activity that took place online, mainly offensive postings on Twitter and Facebook, or that further 16% of the 212 posts had not been verified. Not all the online abuse even originated in Britain. So contrary to the group's claim of a cycle of violence and a sustained wave of attacks, only 17 of the 212 incidents, well 8%, involved the physical targeting of people, and there were no attacks on anyone serious enough to require medical responses. Now, this organisation begs for support on Facebook and usually gets the kind of abuse that it states is being used against Muslims, which is quite gratifying, because I've come across some really subversive stuff that they're doing lately. So basically, there's an entire industry built on the back of Muslim demonisation. This is from a website. It's Coolness of the Hind. Coolness of the Hind. It's got a very strange title.
Yeah, very strange.
.wordpress. Yeah, it's something that came up. It's all very interesting. Coolnessofthehind.wordpress.com. And it said there is an entire industry built on the back of Muslim demonisation. This counter-extremism industry utilises the rhetoric of preventing terrorism, but perpetuates structural terrorism against the Muslim minority through policies and rhetoric which have the cumulative effect of producing a suspect community. Exactly. And this is why a lot of Muslims turned against what was happening with Tell Mama and the contest strategy and the prevent strategy, because basically what was happening is that they'd say something in school or college, and the next thing is the anti-terror police would be around the house quizzing their parents about something they might have said, and maybe they just said, maybe it's terrible what goes on in Palestine, so maybe they should look at the Hasbara handbook before actually getting involved and saying anything, So this reinforces Islamophobic stereotypes. Of course, that's what it's there for. So these organisations are actually there to reinforce these stereotypes which come out of these mad organisations, which were known as the intelligence services, known as MI5, which is basically a bunch of civil servants saying that everything's far right now, because obviously the next threat is Brexit, So this reinforces Islamophobic stereotypes, definitely. It says here that Muslims are inherently potentially violent and less civilised, this is what they tend to put over, isn't it? So in other words, that there is a radical extremist element throughout the Muslim community, which there isn't. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to impose a divide and rule strategy, the same as they're doing with all the other things like hope, not hate.
And then you've got people like Tommy Robinson who actually exacerbate it all, and he's obviously controlled well.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, he's totally being funded by the funders of and backers of people like Katie Hopkins and of course Pat Condell and David Vance. Yeah. These sort of propagandists who are trying to attract what is going to be known as the far right. That's what they're there for. They're creating it, They're to polarise the situation. Yeah. So people new to this would say, well, I agree with everything she said. Well, you might agree with everything she said, but you have to look at who she represents.
Exactly.
And who she shares a platform with. And what her intentions really are. And what she's really about. And do some research into that. I won't mention Tommy Four Names tonight because we've actually covered him on too many shows, and I don't want to give him the oxygen of any more publicity. Yeah. So Eric Von Essex has quite eloquently said, "I think George Boras is the problem, mate."
Boras. I love Eric. Hello, Eric.
Yes, so Eric's also said, a friend of mine and I talk openly about what is going on using Cockney rhyming slang, and the brainwashed haven't a clue what we're talking about. Now, that's very good, actually, because I suppose things like apples and pears are going to be lost on snowflakes, aren't they?
They are. They won't know what your apples and pears are. No.
Oh, Tony's in chat. Good evening, Tony. Piss myself laughing, Eric. Okay, Pat Condell, failed comedian extraordinaire. He's as funny as watching wood warp. I think Eric's dominating chat here tonight.
Good.
Now, this is interesting, actually, because this Tell Mama came out of the prevent and contest kind of era. These strategies to identify those vulnerable to extremism and counter anti-Islamic rhetoric but is now, as we know, reserved for those who voted Brexit. Yes, how did I preempt myself there? That's exactly what I said without getting on to the next point. So this categorisation of hate and race crime has huge advantages in the divide and rule system of identity politics. They have just released a guide for the workplace, have tell mama, shamefully backed by the GMB union, that's my opinion. A guide for the workplace in partnership with the GMB. It carries on. This is from the forward. Since Brexit, we have seen a rise in reported hate crime cases. OK, now, could that be anything to do with what we've been talking about? I think it might be. So, in other words, they've blamed everything on Brexit, including the Joe Cox murder. And they're not going to stop there, because that was pretty extreme. Didn't stop Brexit. It didn't stop people voting. But it's indicative of what we're talking about here. In other words, subversion. It carries on here. Against this backdrop, the role of unions in challenging racism in the workplace and in the community is more important than ever. BAME and LGBT workers are well represented in the trade union movement, and unions have a long history of fighting against racism, homophobia and the far right. Oh, here we go, the far right has to be the last one, doesn't it? It's like, yes, I suppose you think 9/11 was an inside job. I suppose you think that the state had something to do with 7/7, and I suppose you think that Elvis's brain is on the moon. Yeah, here we go. This is what we're doing here. That was Steve Jennings, senior organiser and political officer.
Yeah.
OK, for the union. No sooner had Nigel Farage's breaking point poster, this is carrying on, been rolled up and vote leaves red bus quietly parked out of sight. It was clear the country was still divided on the merits of Brexit. After the vote, the Brexit fault line in our society has widened further, with EU nationals, Muslims and people of colour beginning to report one common thing: an increase in hate crime. This guy's a lying subversive, in my opinion.
Yeah.
These people are getting huge amounts of money for basically promoting this state propaganda. With no evidence. They just sit in offices. They're scroungers, in my opinion, and they're parasites. It carries on. Brexit divides Britain into two very distinct groups, and there is little prospect any deal can be agreed. Well, Brexit doesn't actually divide Britain into two very distinct groups. They do. They're dividing Britain into groups. They're creating the narrative. They're creating the divide and rule, the two lies, basically. And the thing is that people who vote Brexit weren't far right, and of course all this stuff like the demonisation of Jeremy Corbyn, just because he's stuck in the middle of it, is even more subversive.
Well,
so,
we're divided on in lots of ways. I mean, suddenly this whole climate change thing has ramped up as well, with the IPCC pushing out more disinformation, just literally as Brexit's been being pushed through. And it's almost as though they want us arguing about everything. They want us arguing about Brexit, with climate change, just about everything. Right wing, left wing. It's a nonsense. Anti-Semitism. It's just the whole thing is just there to divide everybody and get everybody arguing, so that nobody can actually unite and push anything through.
Yeah, and it's very simple, isn't it? I mean, it's that what we talk about, the raft of ideologies. Brexit, climate change, and Trump. They always do it in threes. Because if you actually agree with anything that if you go against anthropological global warming, if you go for Brexit, or if you support any of Trump's policies, you're a far right extremist. And I see this being put out by people that I've actually shared space with, and talked to. And you get to the point, this is the whole point of it, that the divide and rule strategy will start becoming part of personal life, and all that. So there's certain people I can't talk to about Brexit, but those people know nothing about the European Union, they know nothing of history, and they think it's a happy clappy thing, and we're not going to be brothers and sisters anymore. This is the level of their kind of intellect on it, so you can't really go anywhere with it. And really what you get to the point where you sort of quite enjoy peeing on their bonfire, and I'll just do it once, I'll just put in one thing just for effect.
That's terrible.
I know, but I've been reading the Hasbro handbook, haven't I? I've been very easily influenced here. So Eric von Essex, I'm sorry to give this politically incorrect person a platform. He should be no platform. He said,
"Come on, Eric, what are you saying?"
Katie Hopkins, who has the face of a bulldog's bum, is a sort of Israeli PR consultant on acid. And Balaclava's just put in, leave the comedy to Condell, Eric. I'm glad to see they're having some fun banter and some politically incorrect fun in chat tonight. Hello, Angie. Good to have you in chat, and thanks for putting us up in sunny Salford.
Thank you, Angie. We had a lovely time.
Yes, and we're going to have more of those. But yes, this thing I was talking about, Brexit divides Britain into two very, very distinct groups. It was from a paper published by, guess who? Hope Not Hate. Nick Lowes, Chief Executive of Hope Not Hate, said, despite the turbulent events of recent months, it is heartening to see that England remains overall a liberal and tolerant place. Well, it wasn't for him when he turned up in the East End. They told him to get back in his car and leave. You know, so yeah, he was a victim there, all right. All these subversives are linked, Hope Not Hate and Tell Mama, etc. However significant challenges... Oh yes, here we go. However, significant challenges remain, with Brexit likely to dominate politics in years to come and set to trigger feelings of betrayal amid a tough period of economic downturn.
Again, yeah.
About feelings and about predictions that they know nothing about, because they sit in offices... Catastrophising from their latte-covered desks, from the back of their Mac computers, and then this is all down to subversion and their belief system. Yes, it's all about feelings, you see. This is it, Narcissists versus Activists. From their guide on how to spot discrimination, right? Now this is the Tell Mama thing we're talking about here. Discrimination can be direct or indirect. Direct discrimination occurs when individuals or groups feel unequally or unfairly treated because of a protected characteristic. Now that is absolutely unbelievable, isn't it? So in other words, if you've got hurt feelings, it's about inequality. Well, wait a minute. This is the whole point of it, isn't it? It's to start people calling everything into an identitarian arena. In other words, it's because I'm this. For instance, everything's about identity politics now. So you get the subversive, who's the CEO of Waltham Forest Council. Now, she described herself on Twitter as a feminist. And not first and foremost the leader of the council. Do you see what I mean? So it's all about this stupid identity politics. And that is what these people are promoting. I mean, you see it a lot, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's silly because I know this sounds harsh, but we're not all equal. And you know, it's a bit like, you know, sort of this whole thing about, you know, you don't have to have a womb to be a woman, all that kind of thing that's going on at the moment. I'm sorry, you know, there are differences, and you can't all be the same, and that's what actually all this this propaganda wants us to be. They want us to be homogenised. But you can't, not everybody, and you can't be offended if you're not equal, because there are some people that literally have more of an education than others, and if you're given that opportunity, you know, there are some people that don't want to do certain jobs and want to do other jobs. People have always been different, and you can't expect everybody to be the same. And this is what people are expecting. They're expecting everybody to be the same, and it's impossible. Am I being mad thinking that?
No, that was brought up brilliantly by Yuri Bezmenov, because he said, why should an unskilled immigrant have the same rights as me? What he was saying was, in effect, he wasn't really talking about us being equal in the respect of some kind of spiritual identity. He was talking about what actually makes things work. In other words, he was said, I'm paying all these taxes, I've never ever been unemployed, so why should somebody who comes into a country like America, this was in the 80s, sitting there doing nothing and claiming benefits and not putting anything back, have the same rights as me? They don't. That's what his point was. Yeah. And this is the whole point of what these groups are about. They're creating this divide and rule strategy because they actually create the resentment that's needed. That's the whole point. Exactly. They're just giving the state what it needs.
It's an impossible task, you know. And the thing is that if you constantly are getting this thing about people being offended because, you know, they you know, their feelings are hurt because they're being told, you know, a particular narrative or whatever, then it shuts people down. I mean, that's the whole thing, isn't it? It's to shut people down from you know, having any debate whatsoever, because in case you offend someone, it's ludicrous.
Well, that's exactly what it's for, yeah. It carries on, an example would be refusing to promote an employee because of their religion or offering jobs only to male applicants. Now what that does is it's because I'm foreign, or it's because of this and because of that. Now the point is that what all of these people do, and I've sent stuff to Hope Not Hate about real racist things that have gone on, and they don't respond because it's not their remit to do it. They're not actually there to point this stuff out. They're there for an agenda. So they're parasites who sit in offices and pontificate about the far right and stuff they know nothing about and they've never experienced and they never will experience. That thing that they put into this pamphlet is absolutely incredible, really, that a union would get behind such an organisation as Tell Mama, which has been discredited by our own government. This is from 2016. The government's announcement and the impending rollout of new improved recording mechanisms will put Islamophobia on par with anti-Semitism in terms of better quantification of hate crime. In other words, yes, let's keep those figures rolling in. Yeah. We need more and more hate crime. We want to stamp out hate crime by creating loads of it. And
Well, they've invented it, so they've got to keep the lie going, and they're just going to keep inventing all these statistics so that they've invented a divide. That's all, isn't it?
That's right. This from MEND, which is a Muslim and anti-extremism website, and it states about think tank Quilliam. Now, this Quilliam was set up by Majid Nawaz, and you can read all about that on windowsontheworld.net. It's a very interesting article which I've compiled from a lot of information called State Subversion, Majid Nawaz and Quilliam, and he's a change agent extraordinaire, is Majid Nawaz. He's a presenter on LBC. He's been trained and trained and trained to be the way he is. So this from MEND, the problems that Quilliam has been causing in counter-extremism. Right? 1, hiding conflicts of interests, which they have a lot of. Check that out. 2, using a poor methodology which is highly ideologically rather than evidence-driven. In other words, making it up. 3, having little positive demonstrable outcomes. Because nobody seems to actually like these organisations because Prevent and the predecessor Contest were actually hated by Muslims, and they're meant to be there to help them and to point out the extremists amongst their midst. Now, what's interesting is that the extremists amongst their midst years ago were found out to be, guess what? Employees of the state, MI5 agents. Shock, horror. You can't tell me that you had trained MI5 agents in the Muslim community going into mosques trying to find people who want to be radicalised. I would never have thought of such a thing. I mean, what possible benefit would that have?
Exactly. And all it seeks to do is to actually make people believe that they're victims, and just make them feel that they have no power, which is what it's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this could be used to describe Hope Not Hate, Tell Mama, Quilliam, all in one. See our article, State Subversion. Yeah, see that article, State Subversion, Majid Nawaz and Quilliam. So the abuse of the Race Relations Act and those who manipulate it has caused innocents to be targeted and those who are liars to be rewarded. This is so true, and it happens time and time again. In other words, you get these devious people who want to make something for themselves, and I've been the victim of this, and I know a lot of people who have. So they either pull out a race card or some kind of victim entitlement, and they report you for something. And I've actually had the police on the phone to me by subversives who took over my friend's charity. And the copper was saying, well, look, I think it's better you two don't speak to each other. I said, I don't want to speak to this person. I said, all they've done is libel me for the last 12 months, cause hatred against me, and I've never had any recourse. I said, where's my recourse? I'm the victim. What do I do about it? You know. So, yeah, the abuse of the Race Relations Act, that's pretty bad. It's open to abuse and actually can discriminate against the real victims, as we've said. So now on to agents of change. Now, this also encapsulates the promoted community leaders who are plucked out of nowhere, oh really, as change agents to promote the fake narratives of think tanks, NGOs and so-called intelligence agencies. One such character appeared recently in Facebook feed, spouting the words of a PR press release, which was basically a bunch of generalised cliches with no specific detail. And that's how you spot them, isn't it?
Yeah.
I want the world to be a better place. I want to be able to implement some kind of change,
change,
but I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Yeah, it's all about implementing change, but change to what? Even they don't know.
Yeah. So basically start out with some kind of nihilistic worldview that's meant to be in their past, and it shows you them walking through a council estate, even though there's none left.
Yes. No council estates left. It's tend to stack and pack very expensive homes.
Yeah.
And it's that whole idea of utopia, isn't it?
Right.
It's the utopian ideal, and that's what they're giving people. They're trying to sell people
bland positivity.
Exactly. Some sort of utopian ideal. Exactly.
Yeah, these characters you use to discredit facts and promote manipulated statistics. This is a lot of what it's about, and these organisations like Hope Not Hate, they feed off these change agents, favoured narratives. I mean, let's go from gang violence to climate change. This is what I put on this thing. You've got this change agent. I mean, it is clearly, this is an act, right? It's clearly an act. And this guy said, well, I wanted to do something for my community. Well, he's a change agent. It's been changed and mentored. So the next thing is we're going to go from, I got out of gang violence, we've got to do something about climate change. You can absolutely guarantee that is what he's going to do,
Yeah.
And people on there just sort of, they kind of agreed with it. But when they put these things out, I mean, they're so obvious, aren't they? They're clumsily done. They're as clumsily done as those ISIS videos, done by Bell Pottinger.
Exactly.
Oh no, cut away before he sets on fire.
Yeah.
And they're done from. They've got basically a steady cam, thousands of pounds worth of equipment. I mean, what would ISIS be doing with that in the middle of the desert?
No, exactly. But these people actually believe that they're doing good. I mean, they've been mentored, and they are actually convinced that they're actually doing something good. They have no idea where their mentoring has come from and what it's actually going to lead to.
Yeah, it's the feel-good factor, isn't it? I mean, basically, it's the narcissist thing. But this is what I get about these change agents. They're always really narcissistic. They're horrible people, usually. I haven't met a nice one yet anyway, but I'm sure there may be one day. Check out our Grenfell Tower Agenda Explained video, where we predicted what would happen after the liabilities were removed and the change agents brought in to discredit the real witnesses and control the narrative. Look how many Grenfell fraudsters we see. They keep bringing it up all the time, don't they?
Exactly.
And the man with the silly hat and the stick who took over the meetings, ranting.
Yes.
All of these people have been brought in as predicted. The lack of detail in everything media orientated is stunning. News stories appear without reference, fact or detail. Have you noticed this, Sandi? It's quite incredible that you get these news stories and they're basically not about the key issue that they're talking about. They tack on a side issue, and the side issue
is diverted onto
something
else.
As though
they want to bring another agenda into it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you see this all the time. I think the Guardian's probably the worst because they have it every day. But the Independent and all the rest of them, the Daily Mail, are no better. They just promote it all the time. But once you start seeing this stuff, it's just a recurring theme now, isn't it? I mean, how many more stories can they demonise Brexit with? It's just incredible. That let's get on to another subject anyway. I think we better move on because we're actually we're going to run out of time. Which we're going to come back in part 2, though, probably with Piers Corbyn as well. We've got quite a lot of extra stuff to get to. But it says here, British intelligence infiltrates Voice of Europe media. Now, Voice of Europe is, to me, probably controlled opposition. And guess what? It's now been found out. It is! In a startling revelation, an editor for a major populist online publication, Voice of Europe, is accused of working for British police intelligence as part of a programme targeting political organisations in the UK and broader Europe. According to a statement from identitarian blogger Peter Sweden Emanuelson. Now wait a minute. This is interesting. The problem here is that Peter Sweden does not live in Sweden, right?
Okay.
Right. So he was going on about all the rapes in Sweden and all the social things, but he doesn't live there. So he's getting it off the news just as we're getting it off the news, right? And apparently, the police went to visit his parents in Sweden. Why would they visit his parents in Sweden when he lives here? So there's something gone a bit wrong here.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's a bit of a giveaway is that he's meant to be representing Sweden, and he just put a tweet out, I fully support Israel. Why would you do that out of the blue? That's a bit strange, isn't it, Katie Hopkins?
Oh, wow. So he's been reporting on rapes at obviously didn't
basically
occur.
he called himself Peter Sweeney. Now the story here is that he's allegedly disappeared and they're worried about him. Well, I'm sure someone could find him. I mean, the thing is also that all he does is post stuff on Twitter. So why would anyone want to do anything to him?
Yeah.
He's being protected basically.
Well, he must be, yeah.
Yeah, so the operation was first exposed on January 1st, 2019 by independent researcher Nicholas Munro, who had grown concerned over the disappearance of Peter Emanuelson, or, it says here, a Norwegian-born UK national living in North Yorkshire.
Emanuelson?
Yes, could have a connection there, couldn't he? He could have a connection. I wasn't going to bring that up.
No, sorry.
Emanuelson, who was known for his affiliation with identitarian and populist movements in Europe, such as Defend Europe, had caused alarm by ceasing his usual constant Twitter activity for the month of... Maybe he got a life.
Maybe
he went out for a walk.
Maybe.
You know. Munro's investigations revealed troubling indications that Emanuelson had become wrapped up in a British police intelligence operation that has been known to target right-wing and far-left political movements across Europe. Emanuelson had become engaged in November to an editor and second-in-command of the right-wing populist news website Voice of Europe. The editor, known by the moniker of Laura Cat, claims to be a 25-year-old unmarried woman. Well, I hope so, because he's just married her.
Yes.
So
it would be a bit of a problem if she was
So he's
married.
a bigamist as well, is he?
Yes, a bigamist, yes.
Claims to be a 25... Yeah. However, Laura Cat's own social media posts established that she is in fact a married mother whose brother-in-law is an employee of the UK Metropolitan Police. So there you go.
Oh, wow.
Counterintelligence.
Yeah.
What a surprise. This website has all the hallmarks of one set up to attract what MI5 are looking for. The rise of the far right. Now, isn't that hilarious?
That is unbelievable, actually. I hadn't seen that. That is incredible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was always suspicious about him because you're always suspicious about people who've got one thing, that's just one thing.
Yeah.
They never get off the subject.
So it was always about rapes in Sweden?
Yeah, and what was going on in Sweden and migrants. So betting people here to hate migrants, basically. Yeah.
Now, because there was that whole thing about Malmo being the rape capital of Europe, and you know, I knew people that lived in Malmo, and they were saying, "Well, it's not true."
Right.
So I don't know. Who knows what the truth is? We're not there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are these really bad incidents, but the point is that when these people come up as bastions of the truth, I mean, they never are. That's the thing. No. I mean, you can always tell when they've got one agenda, you know, when they've just got one track agenda like that, and these other giveaway tweet, you know. But that I found quite interesting because I was wondering how long it would take until he was outed. Well, he's basically outed himself, so well done, Peter, not from Sweden.
Not from Sweden.
Peter from North Yorkshire.
Emanuelson, or
yes.
his name is,
yes. Yeah, anyway, let's crack on with the last bit of the show. In 2009, it says here, The Guardian revealed that a British police officer had travelled to 22 different countries on a fake passport, including Ireland, Iceland and Spain, and he targeted movements including green, anti-racist and anarchist groups. This was Mark Kennedy. He was a member of the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, a secretive organisation run by a private limited company, which allows it to remain exempt from freedom of information laws and other public accountability checks and balances. Now, I wanted to bring this up because it goes on about the police infiltrating movements, but the police no longer have to do that. The movements are themselves the infiltration.
Yeah.
Can you see where I'm going with this? So all of these things like Extinction Rebellion, coming on from Occupy and Reclaim the Power and all of the rest of that stuff, these controlled opposition groups, basically the globalists need the anti-globalists, so they create the anti-globalists. And it doesn't really matter about infiltration anymore because subversion is everywhere and it's now complete, so it doesn't really matter.
So they don't have to do anything.
No, they don't have to do anything.
Basically, when Occupy became climate camp, that's what. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah. So in other words, there's no need for undercover police now because these globalist people are policing the job for the police. Basically, they're doing the job for the police, and I think that's a really interesting thing. So we've reported on a lot of that in the past, such as Crime Stoppers actually partnering with ESRI, a data mapping and surveillance company. So you've got this whole corporate infrastructure now, so you don't really need all that. And that just brought that up, basically, that was a private company, a private limited company, the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. So this is corporate state power. Oh, isn't this what they blame on fascism, the state and corporations? Well, it's actually not that. It was about the state looking after the interests of the people above foreign interests, basically, outside that, so... we're in the post-truth world, so none of these terms mean anything. They've all been stripped of their meaning now, haven't they? Yeah, but it just carried on. A database published by The Guardian, oh my God, on October 15, 2018, revealed that British police had infiltrated 124 movements since the 1970s and would even engage in sexual relationship with targets. Well, the police, they get done for sexual deviancy every day of the week, right? And it's actually been proved that the police are generally more dishonest than the public. Look up the statistics on that. That's a really interesting thing. And nothing that I've just said there goes against my own experience, by the way. According to a statement from Emanuelson, back to him again, Laura Catt also works with an unnamed anti-trafficking charity that collaborates with MI5 and the US Department of Justice. Busted. Peter Emanuelson, Sweden from Yorkshire. So there you go. We could finish off with the European Union. Basically, this is from disobedientmedia.com. An authorisation body with a humanitarian face by Jiri Payne. The Lisbon Treaty created an authoritarian political system that infringes on human and political rights. In a democratic system with a healthy balance of power, a ruling coalition can be challenged or replaced by the opposition. This is precisely what is lacking in the EU, as the Treaty of Lisbon requires that European Commission members be selected on the basis of their European commitment. This means, in effect, that anyone with a dissenting view may never become a member of the Commission. As history repeatedly demonstrates, where there is no opposition, freedom is lost. And that's about the Lisbon Treaty. Article 4 states, in part this is, the member states shall facilitate, they're going to have facilitators, you see.
Yeah.
That's good, isn't it?
They've probably got co-facilitators.
That's
as
right,
well.
yeah. The member states shall facilitate the achievements of the union's tasks and refrain from any measure which could jeopardise the attainment of the union's objectives. Oh, change. Be the change you want to see.
Yeah.
In other words, the interests of the union are above the interests of individual states and citizens. So all of that really ties into what we've been talking about tonight.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it is interesting, and I'm sure you'll bring it up with Piers when he comes on, because there's this whole thing about Jeremy Corbyn being sort of somehow disloyal to his members by being pro or anti-EU at the moment, and he's historically always been that way. And again, he opposed the Maastricht and the Lisbon Treaty, so, and many more things. I mean, he's always been that way, and as you can see, it's simply a control mechanism. Both of those treaties disempower people. They don't give them powers; they take it away. And,
well, yes, that's the whole point of it. And the people who are screaming about that and all the rest of the stuff, the climate change stuff and some of Trump's policies, obviously we don't agree with everything Trump says, and nobody has to. But the point is that this demonisation of everything into this raft of ideology, which is so narrow, is absolutely pathetic. And identity politics and this narcissist versus activism thing is very important, because narcissists are becoming activists of the state. They are becoming the anti-globalists whom the globalists are funding. So narcissism is all part of social engineering, the selfie. It's all about the self, making yourself feel good. It all came out of the New Age, the positive thinking stuff that came out of Think and Grow Rich and all that in the 30s and carried on throughout the New Age. All of it's about the self, me, and more me. And people are just about identitarian politics. So they can't see outside themselves. If they can't see outside themselves, then how can they be proper activists? Because they don't know what's going on. That, in conclusion, was what I was talking about tonight. So we'll be back in 15 minutes, probably with Mr. Corbyn. So look at the next show in Windows on the World's large archive if you want to hear more on this subject. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Oligarchy at a
Welcome to Windows on the World. I want to keep bringing our listeners well-researched and useful information. Please consider sponsoring our work by going to windowsontheworld.net and clicking the donate button.